Hello. Hey guys, welcome to our special Saturday episode of SG Explained. Thanks for joining us. If you're asking why we're doing it on a Saturday, we thought we'll try something different. Also, because Willie and I are slightly busy this holiday season.
We're traveling.
We're traveling around a lot. I just came back from a trip actually, and Willie's going to be traveling pretty soon. So we thought, why not use this as a way to experiment? We'll try doing it on a Saturday, and this is why we're doing it. The topic for today is basically quite interesting. We're going to be taking something quite recent about the Malaysia-Singapore dispute over borders. I think a lot of us have been very curious about what's happening. We know there's a lot of heated arguments going on, especially with the recent elections in Malaysia and what that means for everyone. So we thought, why don't we actually go and do an episode about it, trace the history, trace actually how these borders or even pseudo borders, right, like these regions of control that we have, what do they mean, and how does that affect us? So I actually know nothing about this. Willie, this is your domain of expertise, both because you're naturally interested in this, but also because you've done a lot of work in your NS related to this. So
or somewhat having a basic understanding of borders is very important for the military.
Sure. So I thought, why not you lead the charge on this, and I'll ask questions along the way.
And of course, for those who are watching today, if you have any questions, leave it in the comment section, and then of course we definitely want to find out and really hear from you. What are your views about the recent border situation, and really what are your thoughts about how we can manage this as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and of course, if you have any questions of things that we're going to be talking about today, of course, definitely leave a message as well. We really love to hear you.
Yeah.
And of course, once again, if you have any topics that you feel that we should do for the next episode, likewise, please leave a message. We really love to hear that. You know what? Today we're going to be talking about the Malaysian-Singapore border history.
Okay.
And also about what exactly are the current borders and situations that we have right now.
Right.
And I think I think a lot of people might not realize, but that Singapore is not in contest with just the borders along its coast, but it's also disputes among the borders in the airspace as well.
Right.
So there are two things going on right here.
So are you saying that it's not just a land border, but there's also a sea border or a maritime border, and also an airspace border?
Typically, I mean, wars are fought over land and sea borders, right? I mean, typically land borders, and then thereafter sea borders.
Right.
And now I think there's some situations in which people actually are determining, especially in our region, about who has the rights to manage the air control borders as well.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that is something that really complicates a lot of things as well.
Yeah.
And I think people may not have a really full idea of what's going on. What exactly is determined by sovereignty, and what is actually a managed area of borders.
Right.
Yeah. So that's really something we'll be discussing today.
Yeah. And I guess it's interesting because Singapore is an island, so technically we don't share borders with anyone, like land borders. But that is also where we have this. I mean, there's so many things. We've had land expansion with like land reclamation. We've had what's happening with our airports and like the need to like manage the airspace beyond just the island. So I can totally see how this is a much more complex area than just what is our physical border, right? I guess that's what you're trying to get at with this.
Definitely. Now, I mean, let me ask you a question, Rovik. I mean, also for all our guests as well. What do you think is the borders of Singapore? I mean, our sovereign borders.
Right.
What is your impression, and how far do you think it extends?
Right. So I think we have the mainland. So we have, as we know in one of our last episodes, this mainland has its own name as well, which I've forgotten. But there's a mainland, and then we have a bunch of other islands like Sentosa and like Pulau Tekong, Pulau Ubin, and those are our sovereign property,
right?
Land, yeah. And beyond that, we have also a a coastal boundary,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that's ours. That's ours sovereign as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all I understand.
And how far do you think they extend? I mean, what do you think, apart from just the land and possibly just, I suppose what you might be indicating is the coastal areas that extend out to a specific amount of
Right.
space out of the land.
Right.
How far do you think this
I have no idea.
borders actually extend?
I have no idea.
Actually, our borders don't really extend out to just how far away we are from our land, or land above sea level.
Right.
It actually extends out way more from some areas as well.
Okay.
So it's quite interesting actually to find out as well. I think there's also things like Petra Branca.
Right.
It really is actually extended quite far away from our land
Yeah.
area, but it's still considered our borders as well.
Yeah.
So these are things that maybe we can also discuss. But let's just jump right in here. And of course, guys, if you have any questions, just please ask. So essentially, the Malaysia-Singapore border is an international maritime border.
Mm-hmm.
So we have no land or specific land that touches another country,
Mm-hmm.
and all our borders are essentially maritime in nature.
Sure.
So compared to other countries like, for example, Malaysian-Thai border,
Mm-hmm.
or for example, the Chinese and the Russian border, we don't have any land-based borders, and all our borders are actually maritime-based.
Okay.
So I mean that's quite obvious for most Singaporeans, but for those who don't know, this is what's happening in Singapore.
Sure.
And between Southeast Asia countries of Malaysia, which lies to the north of the border, and Singapore to the south. So this is essentially it. The boundary is formed by straight lines between the maritime geography coordinates running along or near the deepest channel of the Straits of Johor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So essentially, it's like forming a line, maybe almost right in the middle between Malaysia or Johor and
Okay.
Singapore. And if you just draw a line along the Singapore-Johor boundaries, that's how actually we carve out
Okay.
our land. So the western portion of the border beyond that, that delimited by there was a 1995 agreement that goes into the western sector of the Singapore Straits, while the eastern portion of the border is actually beyond the eastern terminus of the defined border, continues into the eastern section of Singapore Straits. So actually, it's a lot further as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Outside the border defined by the 1995 agreement, this was actually an agreement a long time ago, there is still no formal agreement between the two countries to delimit their common borders, and this has resulted in several overlapping claims. And one of the things I think right now we have in today, especially we're talking about 14 ships incursion into the Singapore seas, the Singapore Sea, is exactly this thing that we're talking about, which is something an agreement. We haven't come to an agreement as to the westernmost, southernmost areas, what that border is actually defined between Malaysia and Singapore, and that's why we have this dispute today.
Right.
Yeah.
Why was there no formal agreement before?
Because I think the last formal agreement was actually the 1995 agreement, and which only carved out to that portion between the land masses of Singapore, between Johor and Singapore.
Right.
But I think through the years, you could also have things like determined by a land reclamation.
Right.
And how do you define those areas? So I think these were some things that weren't really covered on either party might have gone to the table to discuss what exactly those agreements or land areas should be, or rather those borders should be. So this is what we are having today. So essentially, Singapore claims a 3 nautical mile or 6 kilometer territorial sea limit from its borders, or from its land borders, while Malaysia claims a 12 nautical mile or 22 kilometer territorial sea limit.
Oh, wow.
So as you can see, I think at some point in time, if you compare the two land masses, they're going to overlap.
Right.
Yeah, and this is the point where there starts to have disputes about what those land areas should be.
Right.
Yeah, so this is exactly what we have as well. And similarly, I think that is also what's happening to the other side in our eastern borders as well. So I think let's continue and see what we can find out, right?
So far what you've been talking about is the western and southern part.
That's right.
Okay.
Which is, I think, conveniently something that has been in dispute. I think as of today, there's only one boat left in the supposed Singapore claimed waters.
Right.
That the Malaysian government vessel is still residing in.
Right.
Yeah. So following the International Court of Justice decision on 23rd of May 2008 on the sovereignty, we're talking about now the eastern side of Singapore, the sovereignty of Petra Branca, which is like almost like a series of rock formations at the very extreme eastern side, which gave sovereignty of Petra Branca, they gave it to Singapore.
Right.
So the new portion of Malaysia-Singapore maritime border around the island will also need to be determined. So this is also something that I think even after there's a 2008 ruling by the International Court, there are some areas that still needs to be determined as well. So the island lies, this island, a series of islands called the Petra Branca, actually lies 44 kilometers from the easternmost part of Singapore.
That's really far.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like almost one more Singapore away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also about 14.3 kilometers southeast of the Malaysian coastline.
Right.
So if you can imagine, it's like Singapore and really an extended amount, all the way 44 kilometers away, where we actually have borders up to that particular rock formation.
Right. So what was the logic behind giving it to Singapore? Because I always heard about Petra Branca and I understood it as an issue of sovereignty, because if that was given to Malaysia, for example, we'd be seceding some kind of like sovereignty to them. If it's so far away, what was our interest in keeping it? Number one, and why was it such a big deal?
I think one of the things could potentially be, and the court rulings was determined by the fact that the British actually left us with the inheritance of this particular lighthouse as well, and also the control of the Petra Branca formation as well.
Right.
Yeah, but of course this has become a series of disputes as well as to what really was interpreted by the during the period of time where Singapore was like a crown jewel of the British Empire,
right?
And how exactly that translates to in the modern day borders as well. And I suppose even that particular rock formation is actually something that is really contested as well. And I think even up to very recent years in the new millennium, in the 2000, it's still up to today, still disputed as to what who actually rightfully owns this. But of course, the International Court of Justice has already determined that for both parties, Singapore and Malaysia. And I think it continues to be sort of like, as much as root already continues to still be a point of dispute up to today. Yeah.
Do you think we'll have time to go into it today? Because if not, we may want to do a whole episode on the logic behind Petra Branca.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I hope that we have time.
Yeah.
Let's try our best. And of course, if everybody really wants to talk about it today, or maybe in the next episode, we can actually talk about it. Yeah. Yeah. So, of course, that to not say that there is no land masses conjoining between Malaysia, Peninsula, and Singapore is not entirely true.
Right.
We have essentially two structural crossings.
Right.
I think everybody knows.
You have the Woodlands one and the Causeway.
That's right. Causeway, and of course we call it the other one called the second link into the western part of Malaysia, and the western coast of Singapore. Yeah. And of course we also have international ferries between Johor and Singapore.
Sure.
Yeah. And this is actually at the eastern end of the island. So kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got two land masses, one in the north, one in the west, and we have another crossing by ferry actually from the east. Yeah. So essentially, this is the whole construct of what we have right now for the Singapore borders, and really, this is all determined by the maritime demarcation of where Singapore lies.
Yeah.
So just for those who are tuning in, just to give a sense of what exactly it is we're talking about the Singapore borders, which extends all the way very close to the Malaysian peninsula on the west coast.
Right.
And right at the south is where the points where the land masses don't actually meet anymore, or rather are not too close. Those areas are the points of contention that we're talking about. And of course, we have the eastern side of between Singapore and Malaysia, where it is the Petra Branca, and really 44 kilometers away from the Singapore borders to this particular rock formation, which actually has a lighthouse. Yeah. So this is the structure of our maritime borders. And down south is a very, very strict international boundary between the Malaysian peninsula and also the Indonesian archipelago as well. So this is actually a very, very determined line. But
so that is actually set.
Yeah, that's already set.
Oh, wow.
But the western as well as the eastern boundaries, right at the south of those areas, maybe Petra Branca is much clearer, but on the west, that's the area where it's really points of contention.
Okay.
So what do you think? I mean, understanding these boundaries, what were your thoughts about how this is like, or
Yeah, I'm just very curious on why no one ever said it, right? I think a key thing is, I mean, and I'm appreciating it, is that it's very difficult to make an agreement, especially when both people don't really want to concede anything. And I think I can understand that probably a reason why we never came to a formal agreement was because we never had to, right? I think there were a lot of other things that Singapore and Malaysia had to settle, or they were basically saying like, why don't we focus on things that actually benefit us, like trade or human capital and all this kind of stuff. But now Malaysia is basically saying like, hey, actually, you know what, we want to do something with this maritime area, and that's where the lack of a formal agreement kind of becomes an issue, because now Singapore is like, whoa, we never actually agreed on this.
That's right.
You can't just unilaterally say something and then make it so.
That's right. That's right. So let's talk about. I think we wanted to hear about what exactly is the history of how this entire border was actually
absolutely
right.
Yeah.
So let's look at it. Essentially, the history is the border between Malaysia and Singapore only came into existence in the 19th century.
So very recent.
Yeah, with the establishment and subsequent cessation of the island of the British East Indian Company. We've heard this name a lot, right?
Yeah.
Especially British East Indian Company. By the Sultanate of Johor in 1824. Right. Prior to that, Singapore was an integral part of the Johor Sultanate and subsequently the Johor Bahru Sultanate as well. So I think a lot of, for those who know, in our last episode, we were talking about all these different borders and empires that were actually owning the Malaysian Peninsula, the Indonesian
This is our pre-colonial history of
exactly,
Singapore.
That's right. And of course, we've been shifting borders so often. It's really difficult to actually determine what is a historical standpoint, or where should we then determine those borders, because we're Sharavana period, we have different periods. I think that's really very hard, historically very difficult to determine. Right. So the border changed from being an international border to a sub-national boundary, and vice versa several times. It became an international border after the cessation of Singapore to the East India Company by Johor in 1824, as Johor was now de jure, how do I pronounce this?
Yeah, I think you pronounce it
de jure, a sovereign state. Yeah. So until Singapore was actually a sovereign state separate from the Johor Sultanate, right? Yeah. In 1914, the border became that of between two British-ruled territories when Johor became a British protectorate, while Singapore remained a British crown colony. So when the Sultan basically gave Singapore to the British, they were basically saying, all right, this is an international border because technically Johor is its own thing. But then once Johor became protected by the British as a protectorate, then basically, because both were kind of British related, then it became a subnational territory. That's right. So I think it was also divided due to governance as well. A protectorate as well as a crown jewel colony. And so that's how the entire borders was really formed.
So what happened basically after Singapore and Malaysia and all of that happened, because there was a whole independence.
That's right.
From the colonial rule and all this kind of stuff. So that would have changed everything.
Of course. Yeah. But I think that was actually the point of contention, right? So let's carry on. So on 31st of August 1957, the Federation of Malaysia, which consists of only Peninsular Malaysia, which included Johor as a component state, became independent, and the Johor-Singapore border again became an international boundary between the sovereign state of Malaya and the self-governing British territory of Singapore. So it's between the Malaysian Peninsula and Singapore as a British territory. On 16th of September 1963, Singapore merged and became a component state of the Federation of Malaysia. And rendering the border between two component states of Malaysia, the border again became international border when Singapore chose to be separated from Malaysia on 9th of August 1965. That's the Singapore National Day, and subsequently became independent and it became a sovereign nation.
Wow! So we've had relationships with Malaysia where the border was. So yeah, I think the border becomes a very important issue when it's an international border.
Of course.
Because when it's a subnational border, sure, like you still want to have your domain and you still want to have your clear markers. But at the end of the day, you know that you're governed by the same people. So, and the people who govern are more or less going to be like, all right, like these borders are just in place for some kind of marking, right? But once it's an international border, so that happened, number one, when Johor gave it to the British, gave Singapore to the British. Secondly, when there was a cessation of when Johor became part of Malaya again, right? So the Federation of Malaya, and then finally when Singapore separated, right? The very famous separation from Malaysia on 9th August 1965.
Yeah.
So there's 3 times where we basically had to claim an international border, and the most recent one is, of course, from the separation. So that's actually the market I wish we will be looking at most probably, right? Because anything before, kind of, in my opinion, I have no history of maritime law or border law, but in my opinion, that's basically where history becomes relevant for borders.
So I think it's quite obvious that the borders of Singapore is really determined by when the British Empire and the Malaysian peninsula were actually determined, right?
Right.
Singapore as a British colony and Malaya with its own ruling from Malaysia Peninsula.
Right.
And those and our current borders actually very heavily influenced by when they were separate as international boundaries. Yeah. And so even on technically, I suppose the argument, I mean, as an opinion, would be when Singapore joined Malaysia, they were actually giving away these particular territories that were British owned.
Right.
And then thereafter, when it was rejected, or rather when they were leaving Malaysia, or rather let off from Malaysia,
right.
Those same lines that were previously added to Malaysia were now returned. And these were heavily influenced by how the British were actually determining borders.
Okay, yeah, you're right. Actually, I was thinking about this, and I realized that there is one area of land dispute that we didn't think about, which was the railway station. Remember, because the railway station that was in Singapore, which also I think is worth a whole episode, was contested to be Malaysian property, right? When actually a lot of people were saying, no, it's on Singapore land. Like, why is it Malaysian property, right? So you could claim that to be a land dispute between Malaysia and Singapore.
Right. I think growing up near a railway line as well.
Yeah.
I think there was also points of time where people said that you actually could lay claim to small little plots of land along the railway.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, and then you built your own garden. I think a lot of people were doing that, and then they had these small little like farms along the railway tracks.
Right.
Yeah. So I was growing up to that kind of things. I don't know whether that's true at that point of time, but I saw a lot of people who were actually creating these little plots of land as their own gardens and farms. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
But I don't think you see them nowadays anymore.
No, because I think if I remember correctly, the ex-Prime Minister Najib basically gave the land back to Singapore and said that you guys have it, right? I think there was a deal that was made. I'm not really too sure about it, but I remember.
Could be another episode on its own as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, once again, yeah, you're right. Actually, we had a land dispute at that point of time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but at least for the context of today, I mean, since now that the land area has now been really overcome, right? And I think now everybody now the major dispute is back to a maritime dispute between what is the interpretation of what exactly is the British-owned borders and the Malaysian Sultanate borders, and now how they translate to our modern time.
Yep.
So let's really go into scrutiny about actually what exactly are the disputes. I think we sort of like talked about it a little bit, but let's go into a bit more detail about why we're disputing in the first place, right? So the Malaysian and Singapore government have been involved in a range of disputes and disagreements which had tested the bilateral relations between the two countries. Most of these including that over Karapati Taman Melayu, or Malayan Railway. Karatapi, I'm so sorry. Yeah. Malayan Railway land in Singapore are not territorial or border disputes, as they do not involve questions of sovereignty over territory or territorial waters.
Right.
There have, however, been two disputes concerning sovereignty or territory along the Malaysia-Singapore border.
Right.
The more well-known one is that over Patrabangka, we talked about it,
Right.
which the International Court of Justice decided in Singapore's favor on 23rd of May 2008.
Right.
Another case arose from a complaint by Malaysia over reclamation carried out by Singapore at territorial waters adjacent to the border with Malaysia. The dispute was submitted to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg by Malaysia on 4th of September 2003. I think Singapore was really doing a lot of land reclamation as is part of expanding its country and population as well. And I think this was done over quite a long period of time. Singapore was still doing some areas of land reclamation as of today as well. Yeah. So let's talk about the first thing, which is Patrabangka, right? So Patrabangka, as the island is known in Singapore, or Pulau Batu Puteh, which is known in Malaysia. So we actually have two names.
Right.
Is an island located at the eastern entrance to the Singapore Straits and to the southeast of the southeastern tip of Johor.
Right.
Together with two other marine features called Middle Rocks and South Ledge, they were subject to a sovereignty dispute between Malaysia and Singapore.
Right.
So on 23rd of May 2008, the International Court of Justice decided that Singapore has sovereignty over Patrabangka, while Malaysia has sovereignty over Middle Rocks.
Okay.
Yeah. So there were these group of rock formations. The Middle Rocks belong to Malaysia, and Patrabangka belongs to Singapore. Right. It left the question of sovereignty over South Ledge, which only appears during low tide, to be determined later by stating that its sovereignty would depend on whose territorial waters it was located in. The decision settles both Malaysia and Singapore. Both nations said immediately after the ICJ decision that a joint technical committee would be set up to determine the maritime borders in the waters around Patrabangka.
Right. So basically, the actual land is settled, but the maritime area around it is still requiring negotiation.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So Malaysia filed a review before the 10-year mark of the award in 2017. The review was subsequently withdrawn in 2018 by the new government, putting the matter to rest. So it was actually something that
the new government being a recent Mahathir's government. Yeah, because it's in 2018.
That's right. Yeah, very recent. And so I think they put the matter to rest, but brought out other areas, I suppose.
Yeah.
So maybe let's talk about the Singapore land reclamation case.
Right.
And then that will give us an idea what actually happened and what were these points of dispute on why Malaysia was in dispute about Singapore's borders. Right. So the dispute resulted from Singapore's reclaiming of land in two areas, namely in the southwestern end of the island called the Tuas development, Tuas area. I think there were a lot of industrial areas in the Tuas reclamation sites.
Yeah, I mean, we've been building our recent port there, Tuas port, right?
That's right. I think we had, I think if I'm not wrong, we have water reclamation sites there as well.
Okay, yeah.
We're all in the Tuas area.
Yeah.
And in the and of course, the dispute also follows waters adjacent to Pulau Tekong in the Straits of Johor. So Pulau Tekong being known as a military island, or rather an island that has military training.
Yeah, I mean, we both of us went there for at least our BMT.
Yes, exactly.
So we have memories there.
Definitely. So the latter does not involve any encroachment into the territorial waters of Malaysia, and Malaysia merely argued that the reclamation works will affect the environment of the Straits of Johor as a shared waterway.
So this was with regards to Tekong.
Yes, that's
Basically,
right.
they were saying, Tekong, your land reclamation doesn't really enter into our maritime area, but we're kind of scared that you're going to affect the environment.
That's right.
Okay.
All right. The Tuas development, however, can be deemed as a case of territorial dispute, as Malaysia claims the reclamation works has encroached into its territorial waters in the area called the Point 20 Silver. Right?
The sliver.
Sliver, sorry.
Yeah.
So the Point 20 Sliver, the sliver regarded as an anomaly by Singapore arises as a result of the unilateral declaration of Malaysia's territorial waters boundaries as defined by a 1979 map published by Malaysia, where between turning points number 19 and number 21, Point 20 strikes out to the east of the general continental shelf boundary towards Singapore, thus forming a triangle of Malaysia territorial waters extending eastwards from the general north-south territorial waters boundary.
Yeah.
Essentially, what we're talking about is land masses and rock formations in the water or under the water.
Oh, okay. So basically what we're saying is that Malaysia unilaterally in 1979 made its own demarcation of the boundary that Singapore does not agree with, right? Because while Singapore has the boundary being more or less in a certain direction, Malaysia has it at point 20 going eastwards, which would intuitively encroach into Singapore's space.
Yes.
And so whatever Tuas development is probably going over that point 20
That's right.
Sliver.
So essentially, we are talking about a man-made border, or rather ease of determining where this border is,
right.
whereas probably Malaysia is looking at a geographical standpoint
right.
on how the borders should naturally lie,
right.
using a continental shelf, for example.
Right, and Singapore does not recognize that 1979 continental shelf boundary,
that's right.
and so does not recognize the point 20 silver, and
Sliver,
therefore sliver. Sorry, that's a very tricky word.
Yeah,
and by virtue of that, basically that's an area of dispute.
And I suppose I guess that's where really the point of contention really lies.
Right.
Yeah, because we have a dispute between what is naturally occurring,
right.
and what is created due to how man-made boundaries are actually extended, or
right.
territories are actually extended as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And I can see here that in 2003, like you mentioned before, Malaysia submitted a case for the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And the result that came back on 8 October 2003 was that Malaysia has not shown that there's a situation of urgency, or that there's a risk that its right to respect to the area of territorial sea will suffer irreversible damage. So, pending consideration of the merits of the case, therefore the tribunal doesn't consider it appropriate to prescribe provisional measures. And I think that's because while Malaysia was asking for also a final response, it was saying provisionally, can you do something to stop Tuas development? And the tribunal was saying basically there's nothing too urgent about it. Tuas can continue, and if we make a decision later on, then basically we'll deal with it then, right?
So I think following on, I think because that's sort of like pending judgment, or rather a summary position pending the judgment of what this is actually rejected. So after a 13-month study, the group of experts reported that 57 impacts identified, 40 could not be detected in a computer model, but not likely to be detectable out in the field, while the remaining 70 impacts could be eliminated via prescribed mitigating factors.
So these for all the environmental.
That's right. That's right. So Singapore's agent, I think Professor Tomiko said the happy news, of course, is that two delegations were able to agree on the appropriate way in which these recommendations would be implemented, which allowed both countries to come to more amicable solutions, resulting in termination of arbitration proceedings. But that was then.
So I mean, and that's a good thing, because I think that speaks to the power of bilateral diplomacy, right? Because I'm actually of the opinion that Malaysia, despite whatever political agenda that it may have had, environmental causes are worth thinking about much more thoroughly, right? And Malaysia bringing that up, and Singapore saying like, okay, like sure, we can recognize some environmental impact. Let's kind of deal with that. That to me is a good thing and speaks to the power of bilateral diplomacy.
Right.
But we can also see that for the point 20 issue, the two countries reached an agreement to not deal with the issue.
Exactly.
Right, because so it will be taken up subsequently, and there is no real impact on both sides, like in terms of the rights that we're giving up so far, and so that they can deal with it later, and that kind of snowballs into what we're seeing.
I suppose at some point of time, it almost feels like kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, exactly.
Until we actually can sort it out.
Yeah.
And I suppose everybody is not giving away its position or its rights.
Right.
On how this is supposed to be. So, but at least both countries have agreed at that point of time to subsequently in other negotiations actually deal with it, right?
Right.
But both sides have recognized that neither side has given up on any of the rights they have under international law to the right to resort to other peaceful means of settling this outstanding dispute.
Yeah.
So what this means is that this dispute at these borders, or what Malaysia is claiming, or what Singapore is claiming to this point, was actually an ongoing dispute for a very long while.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and we haven't really come to terms until somebody decided to really take matters into their own hands and really determine what those areas are.
Yeah.
But as far as we can see, this is an ongoing dispute that has been covered for a very long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think really why we're having all these things in the news really is a worthy point of dispute. I think of both sides having this understanding would now clearly understand why Malaysia wanted to put 14 vessels as a means of trying to determine their sovereignty,
Right.
and Singapore trying to also push what they determine as their sovereignty. This was the overlapping dispute as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Is this to do with the same point 20 silver?
Yeah.
Sliver?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like we said, the sliver actually extends into the Singapore territories that Singapore claims, right? Because of the geography.
Right.
Yeah. But that's where, and that sliver is, I suppose, where the 14 vessels that were intruded into Singapore were.
Right.
And now Singapore is contesting that geographical border that Malaysia determined.
Right.
Yeah. So as for now, and of course the land reclamation that was actually determining this, and of course we're waiting for how two countries are going to be determining what exactly how these borders are going to be interpreted in the future as well.
Right. Because from what I understand, the recent movement by Malaysia is basically seen as, from Singapore's side, as an encroachment of the port limits of Tuas's territorial waters off of Tuas, which is exactly what we're talking about over here.
That's right.
Because the Johor Bahru port limits kind of have a similar overlap as well. Wow. Okay. So I think what makes this recent case very interesting is that the maritime issue is one side of it, but it's been conflated very much by the airspace issue, right? And I think that's because basically Malaysia started off with the maritime thing, and then when Singapore said, hey, like, come on, this space is actually ours, Malaysia was like, but you guys took our airspace.
Yeah.
So we're taking the maritime. It doesn't really work that way, for sure, but I think that's definitely what's happening, at least from the rhetorical side of it.
Right.
And to me, I'm actually very confused about the whole airspace issue, because I get the land, I can kind of get the sea part of it and where the disputes are. So we have for the sea disputes, we have the point 20 sliver, and we have the areas around the Middle Rocks and Petra Branca that still have to be agreed on.
Yes.
But what about airspace? What's happening there?
Sure. I think that's a very good point, because that's another area of the border we talked about that we wanted to cover today. And really, I think the sovereignty of airspace is, and this other concept of the management of airspace is completely different.
Okay.
The sovereignty of airspace essentially is, I suppose, is really the immediate airspace that's above the land that you lay claim. Right. But the management of airspace is a totally different thing altogether, and is really determined by the private sector, or rather the board called the International Civil Aviation Organization.
So what you're saying is that for maritime and land borders, those are kind of historically derived based on...
Those are sovereignty.
Yeah, those are sovereign because those can come from, depending on whether you won it in a war, or depending on whether you inherited from a colonial government or some kind of free government. Those are determined. Those are in no way fluctuating or externally managed. But airspace is externally managed.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So if you say that, for example, the airspace above Johor, it should technically be sovereignly held by Malaysia. Right. So above Johor, definitely they meet the airspace. But the management of that airspace could be managed by another country.
Okay. How does that work?
So maybe let's give an idea what exactly is this thing called, or rather this how the management of this airspace, or what is the term used? So this thing that what we call about managing airspace is determined by this word called the Flight Information Region, or we call it by FIR. So FIR, according to the Ministry of Transport, is a specific region of airspace in which flight information service and alerting service are provided and managed by an air traffic services authority appointed by the International Civil Aviation Organization.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's essentially what it does is to manage air traffic services and for flight information and alerting, and how to manage the organization of incoming air vehicles in the air, and how they should fly or should go into certain sectors as well. So the current Singapore FIR includes our national airspace, which is above Singapore, as well as airspace over parts of Indonesia and the South China Sea.
Okay.
Right. There are other examples of the Air Traffic Services Authority of a country managing the airspace of another country as well.
Right.
There are many instances where other countries actually manage another country's airspace.
Right. Because of safety concerns.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So this is actually not determined necessarily as a breach of a sovereign airspace, but really it's just a management
Right.
of airspace,
Right.
for safety concerns,
Right.
or keeping up to standard so that you won't have civil aviation accidents in the air. So this is also a point of contention, I suppose, when we're determining who should be managing whose airspace.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as far as I understand what's happening with Malaysia right now,
Mm.
basically what I'm hearing is that it's actually to do with Seletar Airport and the implementation of what is called the ILS,
Mhm.
or is it Instrument Landing System?
Right.
Right. And the reason for that is because it's requiring any flight to basically use the instrument landing system, and especially airports in the area to use the instrument landing system.
Mm-mm.
And what happens is that by virtue of that, then you are creating additional constraints,
Right.
or requirements on both the airports as well as on flights.
Mm.
And the Malaysian side is basically arguing that this is limiting height limits on developments that can happen.
That's right.
This is limiting this is basically creating additional burden on the
Right.
Malaysian side. And Singapore is basically saying, okay, number one, this is a better system.
Okay.
It's safer and it's more useful. But more importantly, they went through a consultation period, right?
Mm.
So this was where the whole, for people following the news, you would have seen that there was this whole back and forth between Singapore and Malaysia over emails that were sent and
Right.
emails that were not sent and
Mm.
whatever, about like were they actually taking Malaysia's needs in consultation,
Right.
in terms of like, are there any developments coming up? What are the flight limits? And can we work around those? And basically, Singapore said, hey, in this whole time, you never mentioned anything.
Mm.
And then now you're using this as an argument point
Sure.
in this whole thing. So I think that's
Sure.
one area where flight management becomes a sticky issue,
Sure.
because you are creating burdens on the surrounding regions.
Right. Right. So definitely this is really quite troubling for
Right.
a lot of individuals, right, as to how this airspace is being managed and how it actually intrudes into another person's sovereignty. But
Right.
let me just give an idea of how big Singapore's FIR, or Flight Information Region, is.
Right.
All right. The Singapore Flight Information Region is more than 2,000 times bigger than the Republic's own airspace.
Wow.
That's really, really big.
Right.
Right. And of course, and when was this determined? Historically, right, since 1946, Singapore has overseen parts of Indonesian airspace in Raul, including the resorts islands of Batam and Bintan. The responsibility was handed to the Republic by the United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization, called ICAO, which regulates global and commercial aviation.
Right.
So this was historically due to a UN body or UN agreement.
Right.
This was an assigned task for Singapore to govern this particular airspace that's really 2,000 times larger than its own landmass,
Right.
or the own airspace. Right. So and I think, of course, definitely what that means is that it will definitely manage another country's airspace
Right.
for that. And I suppose it crosses across multiple sovereign airspaces as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I know Indonesia has basically argued that they feel like they would be able to take the airspace back.
Correct.
How does that work? Like, is Singapore able to say, okay, like, we want to give it back, or like does the ICAO basically do a determination and say, like, hey, like, actually Indonesia can manage its own airspace now? Is that possible?
Right. I think maybe just to continue as well is the flight information regions are not carved out on national territories. That's
Right.
what we know, right?
Right.
Because it really is based on whether the technical and operational concerns allow for air traffic safety and efficiency.
Right.
I think these are basically awarded based on merit
Right.
of a country or an area's ability to control airspace
Right.
efficiently.
Right. And so we can see that Indonesian President Joko Widodo actually asked his officials in his own national civil aviation management to improve their personnel, improve their equipment, so that they can prove that they can take over airspace.
Exactly. And of course, this is not determined by Singapore.
Right.
In fact, if, for example, Indonesia is able to come to a point where they're able to manage their own airspace efficiently,
Right.
The ICAO may actually award Indonesia the rights to maybe manage a specific airspace.
Right.
But of course, this is in line with the international standards that's necessary.
Right. And so Singapore needs to be competitive in order to, if it wants to maintain this, because from what I'm reading, Singapore actually does have an incentive to manage that airspace as well, because it makes Changi Airport, which is the key central area for most of this management. I'm sure Seletar has its own as well. It makes Changi Airport very competitive because it has to do all of that work from there.
Absolutely.
And if Indonesia is able to catch up, which it is completely within its rights to do, that may affect Singapore's competitiveness as well.
Of course.
So it actually creates a good competition to maintain your skills.
Of course, definitely. and I suppose right now the question would be between disputing sovereignty,
right,
and disputing the management of specific airspaces, and not exactly to lay claim to a sovereignty, are two really different things as well.
Absolutely.
But they are also, in some ways, I suppose, in the airspace concern, may impact certain sovereignty or concerns about sovereignty as well of a nation. And I think this is the point of where our borders actually, like Singapore is not just the Singapore borders, or rather the sea areas around it, but really extends to quite a significant area in its own backyard.
So I think what I'm seeing, what I'm appreciating about all of this is that, number one, it is maybe not immediately an issue of sovereignty because it is so ambiguous, right? It is so fluffy. Maritime and airspace borders, they're all virtual, right? It's not a land border which you can physically see yourself crossing as a human being. But those lines are important both to the country at a sovereignty level, but also to the people, because they determine exactly what kind of work you can do, what kind of developments you can do. The airspace one becomes even more important because of the safety considerations tied to airspace management. I think that is something that can change and evolve based on your competency and your performance in airspace management.
Yeah. So to really sum up, I suppose really there's so many determining factors about and history, and that we are carrying out in this entire border conversation.
Absolutely.
And really it is a mixture of inheritance from people, our past masters, or past how the countries were determined, and also really about international bodies' recognition on certain aspects that things actually determine the way they are.
Yeah, and you can see something like a sliver, the 0.20 sliver, has such a major impact on where you can put your ships, on what TWAS can do, what the JB port can do. Wow. Yeah, it just goes to show how important these negotiations are and how much it's important to have good faith negotiations, right? Because if you have bad faith negotiations where you're basically just trying to impose your will, just trying to basically take advantage of the other group, then you're going to have a situation where a lot of the stuff that was talked about in this past few weeks, right, by both the Malaysian and Singapore side. I remember seeing there was one like pain by 1,000 cuts or something.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that was a very graphic commentary that personally I felt was a bit overextended. And you can see how much impact this kind of stuff had.
But I suppose our Malaysian counterparts as well would also determine, will also be questioning as to like, hey, why not consider this this in some way is a natural occurring sliver?
Right.
It should be really determined as part of our position. And on top of that, this was never ever agreed upon in the first place.
Exactly.
Right.
I can totally see how that argument arises, but there is, that is when negotiation happens and where there is a recognition of like, all right, like what are we trying to achieve here? Are we just trying to achieve a geographical boundary, or are we trying to achieve an actual functional boundary between the two of us that will actually help the two of us
Right.
prosper as nations.
But suppose the interpretation of what exactly is functional for each country
Sure.
will be very different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think of course definitely when it comes to land and sovereignty, everybody of course definitely wants to determine their own interests. Each country has its own interest to see how exactly they should have.
Right.
Similarly, I think to many different countries as well. For example, in the China boundaries for what they determine as the South China Sea
Right.
dispute. These are also disputes about borders as well.
Yeah.
And borders definitely is not just a concern about really this is my land or your land. It's actually about economic interest. It's also about the ego. It's also about military interests as well.
Sure.
The safety of the country is also about trade routes.
Oh yeah.
It's about
Yeah, you're absolutely
yeah.
right. There's so many things.
Yeah, and so many things that actually affect and why there's a need to really determine these borders correctly,
Right.
so that it comes to a point where both countries or intersecting countries
Right.
will want to determine where those borders really lie,
Right.
so that they either gain an advantage or really to really meet their interests
Right.
at hand. Yeah.
Wow. I felt like I learned a lot in this 50 minutes that we just went through. Thanks so much for sharing all of that.
Right.
To those who are listening to us and viewing online, first of all, apologies for the cough, dry throat. I wish I had.
No, you really held it in there all the way.
Yeah, but more importantly, thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing us for the past 10 episodes. It is the holiday season, so from Willie and I, we wish you a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays for anything that you're celebrating. If you're listening to us on podcast or you haven't listened to us on podcast, please go check us out for the longer episode where you can listen to the whole thing. Give us your reviews and ratings, because that helps us get found by more people, and it's very, very important, so please help us out there. But more importantly, we'll see you in January.
Oh wow! This is the last episode for the year. I actually didn't know that. Right?
Yeah. So we're coming back in January with more episodes, but we want you guys to have a say and exactly what those episodes are. Anything that interests you, that you feel are important, or that are way too confusing. Willie and I will do our best to deconfuse them through our banter and conversation.
Right. Anyway, I think this is our last episode. Thanks everyone for tuning in this year. It's been quite exciting, I think. And once again, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and Happy New Year.
Yeah.
See you guys.
See you guys.